The text for this morning's sermon is from 1 Kings chapter 19, and this follows on the story in 1 Kings 18 where Elijah gets involved with the priests of Baal in a big showdown, and that ends in violence. So now as we pick this up in chapter 19, verse 1, we read, Ahab, the king, told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying, So may the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life like the life of one of them by this time tomorrow. Then he was afraid. He got up and fled for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah. He left his servant there. But Elijah himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a solitary broom tree. He asked that he might die. It is enough now, O Lord. Take away my life, for I am no better than my ancestors. Then he lay down under the broom tree and fell asleep. Suddenly an angel touched him and said to him, Get up and eat. He looked, and there at his head was a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. He ate and drank and lay down again. The angel of the Lord came a second time, touched him, and said, Get up and eat, or the journey will be too much for you. He got up and ate and drank, and then he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. At that place he came to a cave and spent the night there. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah, saying, What are you doing here, Elijah? He answered, I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away. God said, Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Then there came a voice to him that said, What are you doing here, Elijah? Elijah answered, I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away. Then the Lord said to him, Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. May God bless the reading of this word. In our home, we have digital subscriptions to numerous newspapers, and we subscribe to several magazines and journals that are news-related. And of course, we, like you, have constantly available cable news and network news on television. It can be too much to take in some days. We hear about extreme weather, health crises, and violence at home and abroad. And confronted with threatening news, it would be easy to imagine that the world is getting worse every day in every way. But that would not be a true perspective on life. In the 20th century, the world was struck with an outbreak of polio. In 1950, there were over 33,000 cases in this country alone. Some died from that disease and others were left paralyzed for life. And then 2 vaccines were discovered, and we instituted better public health measures. So now in 2024, we don't spend much time thinking about polio. We may laugh at the man who supposedly advised staring each day in front of the mirror, repeating the words, "Every day in every way I'm getting better and better." We may laugh at that, but we are too often inclined, I think, to believe the very opposite about the human family and the world. But neither of those extreme perspectives is true. From our Bible story this morning, we hear a very disheartened Elijah pray to God, "It is enough. Now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers." After all of his massive efforts on behalf of God's cause, Elijah had become convinced that he had made no progress whatsoever. "It is enough. I am no better than my ancestors." But Elijah's perspective was distorted. Elijah felt alone, but Elijah was wrong. We can certainly understand that feeling, can't we? He had worked so hard, but what did he have to show for it? Where was the progress? You and I know in our better moments that life is a mixture of both failures and successes. A step forward now, a step back later, and then sometimes 3 steps forward. The bad news perspective, the discouraged Elijah perspective, is not a true view of life and our world. But it's so easy to take on that view of life that says, in spite of our best efforts, things are running downhill fast. That comes largely from the mistaken belief that we are alone in this life with our problems, but we are not alone. There are others around us living through the same kinds of challenges, working for many of the same goals, upholding the same truths. And God is closer to each of us than the air that we breathe. We are not alone. When God met Elijah there in the desert, God asked him, "What are you doing here, Elijah? What is it that brings you way out here into the desert so far from everything and everybody?" And the answer was that Elijah was driven into the desert by fear and by anger and by disappointment. Notice how this story contrasts with the story of Jesus in the Gospels, who was driven into the desert for 40 days and 40 nights by God's Spirit. Elijah was running on the energy of negative emotions and a distorted perspective on the world and his place in it. Elijah was afraid of Queen Jezebel, and he was afraid that all his effort was in vain. And he was angry with his neighbors because Elijah believed that he was the only faithful person left in the whole country. Listen again to verse 10. Elijah answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." Our text seems to question us this morning. What is it that drives us in our efforts from day to day? The answer to that question can make quite a difference. For Elijah, his driving force was zeal for the Lord. The word which is translated jealous could also be translated zealous. Elijah was driven by anger at what was going on around him in his country. And there was a lot to make him angry. The king had married a foreign wife, this Jezebel, who brought with her priests for her own god. But Jezebel was not content to live and let live. She was trying to do away with the worship of the God of the Exodus and replace it with the worship of her own God, a nature and fertility God. So there was religious and political conflict in that society. Passions were running high, and Elijah was working hard to uphold the true faith. But what energy was driving him? Was it compassion, love of people, the pursuit of truth, the joy of a faithful life? Or was it anger and grievance, a dry and burning zeal, and now fear? 1 Kings 18 tells how Elijah himself had gotten caught up in the downward spiral of religious violence. We know that there is a great deal of anger in our own society these days. But we know that anger is not a sustainable energy that can build the world. It runs hot for a while and then burns out, leaving us like Elijah sitting exhausted under the broom tree, saying, "It is enough. I am no better than my fathers." We read in the Gospels how Jesus, when faced with great human stubbornness and lack of compassion, was sometimes angry. But faced with great human need, Jesus was moved by compassion. We do not get the sense that Jesus was a person who was moved from day to day by his anger. It was his love for his heavenly Father and the neighbor that moved him, eventually even taking him to the cross. And it was not fear that drove Jesus' disciples into the world with the Easter message. It was joy. It was not anger or a sense of grievance which helped them face persecution. It was the joy of Easter and the love of Christ's Spirit at work in their lives that did that. Elijah was driven into the wilderness by fear. The powerful anger that had been driving him had burned out, and he sat dejectedly under a broom tree praying to die, believing that he was all alone. But God reminded Elijah that he was not alone. Into the loneliness of Elijah's desert experience, God sent an angel, a messenger of hope. Elijah had run out of energy, and he prayed for an end to his unhappiness. But God sent this messenger with these simple gifts of bread and water and a touch. Listen again to verses 5 through 7. Then Elijah lay down under the broom tree and fell asleep. Suddenly an angel touched him and said to him, "Get up and eat." He looked, and there at his head was a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. He ate and drank and lay down again. The angel of the Lord came a second time, touched him, and said, "Get up and eat, or the journey will be too much for you." That messenger of God brought bread and water and a human touch. It doesn't sound like much, does it? But we are told in verse 8, Elijah got up and ate and drank, and then he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the Mount of God. Without the angels, these messengers that God sends into our lives, and the small gestures of support that they bring us along life's way, our journey would indeed be too great for us. This messenger sent by God gave just a few simple gifts to Elijah that day: some bread, some water, a gentle touch, and a word of encouragement to stand up and move on with his life. In his despair, Elijah had convinced himself that he was all alone. But it wasn't true. He was not alone. God sent Elijah some common, everyday kind of help to continue his journey. And in verse 18, the Lord reminded Elijah that there were at least 7,000 other people in the land who had remained true. All this time, Elijah had imagined that everything depended on him alone. But that is never true, and we are never alone. When Rhonda and I were serving a church in Rhode Island, our region, the American Baptist Churches of Rhode Island, held a 2-day conference one year for trustees, deacons, and pastoral relations committees. And I was asked to lead a workshop for the deacons from several different churches on the second day of the conference, which had begun the night before. Well, the night before, that Friday night, these folks got together and began to get acquainted and began to compare notes about church life. And when I met with the deacons group that Saturday morning, that group of deacons was full of energy. And several of them told me in one way or another, we discovered that all of our churches have most of the same problems. We are not alone. The same problems which had been energy depleting before for these deacons had now become a source of energy when they realized that they were all in this together. We don't do this business of being Christ Church alone. Elijah was not really alone. He had just grown lonely. You and I are not alone with the challenges of our lives or the life of our church. I imagine that God sends messengers to us more often than we realize. They almost never have wings. And we ourselves could serve as an angel to someone else if we are sensitive to the leading of Christ's Spirit. We could be angels sent by God to some neighbor if we are willing to be moved more often by Easter joy and Christmas love than driven by grievance or fear or anger. We are not alone. Sometimes God is the God of the dramatic, but more often God meets us in the everyday, I think. In verses 11 through 13 of our text, we read that Elijah stood at the entrance to that cave. Did you notice the extreme weather that came through as he stood at the opening to the cave? Now, there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. Some translations read a sound of silence. In that quiet moment, God spoke to Elijah. And in that deafening quiet, the direction and pace of Elijah's life was called into question and gave him direction for the days ahead. God met Elijah in the everyday. Most often, that is how God meets us, in the everyday, just to let us know that you and I are not alone. Let us pray. God of creation and Lord of the everyday, meet us in the little things of our lives this week. Help us to be moved by the joy and the love of Christ, our risen Savior. Send us as messengers, and send us messengers to remind us that we are not alone. And Lord, send us to someone this week who needs that reminder. Through Christ our Lord we pray. Amen.